We want again to welcome everyone to this training. All right, this is Challenging Goals and High Expectations presented via webinar. It is November 9th, 2021, and we are welcoming our guest presenter, Diane Perry with the PEAL Center. Just a quick disclaimer from the ARC of Lehigh and Northampton counties. The ARC of Lehigh and Northampton counties Advocacy Department does not employ lawyers nor provide legal advice. This training or any other provided by the ARC's Advocacy Department does not constitute or imply the endorsement, recommendation, or favoring of the providing party or any employees or contractors acting on its behalf. This webinar is being provided for educational and informative purposes only. All right, so I'm going to stop that share. At this point, I will introduce our guest presenter, Diane Perry. Diane Perry has over 20 years of education advocacy and family leadership experience. She is the Family Resource Specialist for the PEAL Center in Philadelphia. In addition to her work at PEAL, Diane serves as the Vice Chair of the State Special Education Advisory Panel, also known as SEAP. Diane's son, David, who is 28, received special education services when he was in school. He is currently attending college, working part-time, and serves on 2 boards, Self Advocates United as one, and Sean King Fund for Inclusive Education. Thank you so much, Diane, for joining us, and welcome. The floor is, and the Zoom is all yours.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and Kodi. And it's great to be here. Tonight, we're going to be talking about challenging goals and high expectations for every child. Before I get started with that, let me tell you a little bit about the PEAL Center, just in case you may be unfamiliar with us. Our mission is up on the screen, and we are the PTI, the Parent Training and Information Center in Pennsylvania. What that means is that we are federally mandated in IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and we are also federally funded. So as a PTI, and there needs to be a PTI in every state, in Pennsylvania, it is the PEAL Center. My role as a Family Resource Specialist at the PEAL Center is that, number one, I do trainings as such as this. Number two, I also provide one-on-one individual assistance to families and caregivers and professionals as well. I help families, professionals navigate the special education system, understanding rights, parental rights, understanding, the rights, procedures, policies, anything that has to do with special education is typically what I can assist with. We also have a colleague who has more expertise in the special healthcare, as far as healthcare and navigating any of those systems, and that's Kelly King. She's our family-to-family resource coordinator. So we do a gamut of services at the PEAL Center. And I would really encourage everyone to go to our website, pealcenter.org, and look at some of the other resources we have. We have lots of archived webinars. We have other trainings and information and resources that are on our website. And we also have a youth department as well. So we do a lot of work, family, leadership for youth as well. So we try to support the whole gamut from birth all the way up to age 26. And tonight, a couple things that you'll hopefully be able to do after the presentation this evening is identifying ways that the evaluation, IEP, and the progress monitoring can support high expectations for your child or student that you serve, which means access to the general education curriculum and what that looks like. And it may look different for each individual child as well. Number two, discuss the significance of the Endrew F Supreme Court decision. And this really, we'll go into more detail about it, but it really speaks to the student who may have more significant disabilities. And if you program, if you accommodate and modify for a child with more significant disabilities, you can accommodate for any child. And the third is listing some strategies for providing access to and learning of grade level content for students with those complex instructional needs. So hopefully you'll get some really good information tonight around all of that. So to get us started, now this I am going to go check on the chat. So hopefully I don't mess up my screen when I do this, but I'm looking to see how much do you already know. So I'm going to go through a couple questions here. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. And there'll be, it's multiple choice, so you can choose the letter. So if you choose the letter and put that in the chat, I would be able to see the results of that. So let me go with the first one. Which of the following is not an example of presuming competence? And for anyone that might be on the phone and might not see this, I will go through all the letters for you to be able to give your answer. So letter A, including a student with typical peers in a lesson about science, even if the student may not be able to participate completely. B, waiting until a student with complex instructional needs has mastered using their augmentative communication system before asking them to respond to questions. C, identifying learning targets that are aligned to grade level standards, but focus on the big ideas. And D, providing options for ways that students can show what they have learned. So the question is, which of these following is not an example of presuming competence? Okay, I'm starting to see some B's. Looks like a unanimous B, and I will agree. Letter B is not an example of presuming competence of the child. Very good, thank you. Next question. What is the role of an general education teacher as a member of the IEP team? A, share information with the team about grade level instructional routines. B, identify potential barriers to a student participating and learning in general education classrooms. C, contribute to the development of standards aligned IEP goals. And D, all of the above. I'm seeing some D's. Good, good. All right, looks like another unanimous letter D for all of the above. And yes, that is correct. Letter D, all of these is the role of a general education teacher as a member of the IEP team. Very good. Next question. When a student's progress monitoring data does not show sufficient progress towards goals, the IEP team should first, A, change the goals, B, add more positive reinforcement, C, evaluate the likely reasons why progress is not being made, or D, make adjustments to instruction. I'm seeing a couple C's. Got a D, C's, okay. All right, I will go with the majority. Yes, it is C. Evaluate the likely reasons why progress is not being made. And to the D, eventually that would lead to making adjustments to the instruction if needed, if that's what they find. So very good. Our next question. The Endrew F Supreme Court decision is important because A, the family was reimbursed for tuition they paid for a private placement. B, it raised the standard for educational progress from de minimis to challenging objectives in light of the child's circumstances. C, the child was able to stay in the private school. D, it emphasized the need for positive behavior supports. So put your selections in. I'm seeing a couple B's. Now, if you're not familiar with it, you might not know this, but I'm seeing the B's, and yes, it is B, raising the standard for educational progress from de minimis to challenging objectives in light of the child's circumstances. And then our last question, which of the following strategies does not provide access to grade level standards aligned content? A, remediating math skill deficits in small group instruction. B, universal design for learning. C, collaboration between general and special education teachers. Or D, identifying key vocabulary and ways to define it. So which of the following strategies does not provide access to grade level standards? Bunch of A's, couple A's. Okay. Yes, it is letter A. This does not provide access, remediating math skill deficits in small group instruction, but all the rest are. So very good. All right, so we got a smart group here tonight, which is wonderful. Okay. So let's start off with talking about presuming competence. And many of you may be very familiar with this term and know what this means. This slide gives participants a definition of presuming competence. So this here does give you, what specifically presuming competence is. It alters of how we start our conversations a lot of times. So when you're presuming competence, your conversation does change. Oh, why that went back, I don't know. But I am going to share a video right now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to reshare it because I want to show you this video and give you a little intro. And please pop your face up if it is not being heard.
I feel like it's so crucial not to underestimate people with disabilities because we can never guess what's inside. And there are students who have such potentials and students who might make a little progress that makes a big life change. And I think we can't know that even though this student didn't learn to read, because I've tried to help him learn to read, he developed just this joy of story listening. And that enriched his life. Because we tried to write, we built his vocabulary. And so now he understands more things we talk about. He never became a writer, but his life was enriched in the trying. And so we can't underestimate and we can't stop trying because we just never know where this journey is going to take us. And we never know what we're going to find along the way that we never expected. It takes us in a different direction sometimes. And we didn't get to Banff, but we found this other place that was pretty darn neat. So keep trying and you'll get somewhere cool and you will have progress, even if it wasn't exactly what you're expecting.
Okay. And I really love that video. It just, she summarizes exactly what presuming competence is. It's the conversation, but yet it's that end result. Sometimes you might hear people say, well, what's he going to get out of algebra? What's he or she going to get out of this? Or what? I'm not sure what the value is. And, Dr. Musselwhite just told you, it might not be what the expectation is of that particular teacher or whatever, but if they get a little bit, if they get some type of, satisfaction, the individual, then you know what? Then it was progress. So, just keep that in mind as we go through this evening around presuming competence. Okay. So it's really up to the adults in the room to figure out how we provide the access, not whether we can provide. It's important that the participation and engagement is meaningful and the instruction works for diverse learners as is considered age appropriate. It's important that your school mirror the community. And I've heard this example before, and some of you may have heard it, but it almost, when you talk about mirroring the community, you know, the first thing that usually pops up in my head is there's no special education McDonald's, right? You know, when you go out in the community, when you're an adult, you know, there is no special education out there, right? There's access, you know, to various places and things that you do, but there's no quote unquote special education, right? So when you think about mirroring your community and presuming competence of an individual, that's what you need to be doing. You need to be asking, like it says here in the beginning, the how, not whether or not you can or not. So, and as I go through the presentation, you know, I will give some various resources and things, places that you can go and research that is going to help you figure out the how. And that's what your tools will be, hopefully, at the end of the presentation. So let's talk about Endrew F, which was, I can't believe it's only been, let's see, that's 4 years ago now. I remember when it first came through, it was like all over, everybody, da, da, da. Now the conversation has kind of gone down, but you know, COVID kind of did that to everything, right? But this case was specific to having high expectations for all students. It also revisited FAPE, the free appropriate public education. So real quickly, I'm going to look at the chat again. Now, we did talk about having questions to the end, but if you come up with the question, you know, please put it in the chat or the Q&A because they are monitoring that for me so that I can make sure that I go back to that. So here's a question for you. Before what year? So type in the year. Schools were not legally required to educate all students with disabilities. Anybody know what that year is? Before when? Schools were not legally required. Okay. What year? I see one so far, 1975. 75 with a question mark. Any other stabs at that? Some of you may have no clue too. That is fine too. But you are correct, both of you. Thank you for participating. It is 1975. And when you think about that, that's not too far behind either, actually, you know. The law that is today known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, which I will reference IDEA as IDEA now that you know what they mean. I don't like to use acronyms, but also for FAPE, I'm also going to say FAPE instead of free appropriate public education. So I just wanted to let you know what those acronyms were. But in IDEA, it changed that by requiring that all students with disabilities are entitled to a free appropriate public education. That is exactly what happened in 1975. Okay. So here are some court decisions that impact interpretation of IDEA. So the way IDEA is interpreted will shift through these various court cases that we have listed here. First of all, in the beginning, procedural safeguards for families were added. That's what's in IDEA, which is really important because that gives the families several options on how to practice their rights, what they can do when they don't agree to maybe what's going on in the school environment, or maybe, you know, an evaluation occurred and they don't agree with that. They have options in the procedural safeguards for an independent eval. So there's several different procedural safeguards in there that are that were added to help families access the FAPE. The Oberti case, that case strengthened the preference for participation in general education curriculum with the use of supplementary aids and services, and that's called the Oberti decision. And so supplementary aids and services are all of those accommodations, maybe modifications that they list after the goals section, where they're actually listing all of these SAS, the supplementary, the specially designed instruction. So a lot of times that's where you see all the various aids and services. And then of course you have related services, PT, OT, things like that, or any other kind of service. But that, the Oberti case strengthened the participation in general education curriculum, utilizing those aids and services so that the child can stay in the general education curriculum and or access to it. Then in 1982, there was the U.S. Supreme Court Raleigh decision, which established a standard for FAPE that required that an IEP be set out to provide more than a trivial benefit, so de minimis. So it had to be more than, you know, that trivial benefit. So you had to, so that strengthened a little bit more what you can do. And here's a little bit more around the Raleigh standard. So this was the Raleigh standard. And the reason why giving some examples here is because it kind of sets the stage for what Endrew F changed in regards to this standard. So during the Raleigh standard, the teacher communicated with the deaf student through this wireless transmitter. The family, though, wanted a sign language interpreter in the classroom because they felt that that would give the child full access to the teacher's communication. But because the student was getting good grades in the classroom, the court determined that this was sufficient to demonstrate FAPE, that the school district was doing FAPE through the wireless transmitter, right? So here's the cases, you know, which way should the child receive that information was kind of the issue, the FM receiver or the sign language. But in the end, the court saw that the child was getting good grades and was showing progress. So what the school was doing was allowing the child to access their FAPE. So that's what this Raleigh standard is about, FAPE. Now, the question in Endrew F case. So let me give you a little bit of background about the Endrew F in case you're not familiar with it. Endrew was a student with autism. He was not making progress. His goals were written the same every year. His parents enrolled him in a private school. Endrew made progress in the private school. So the family was seeking reimbursement for tuition paid to the private school and in fact wanted him to return to the public school. So initially the courts found in favor of the school district. The case made its way all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court found in favor of the family and did away with the de minimis. This is where that de minimis factor came from Raleigh. It took away the de minimis standard that came from the Raleigh case, and then replaced it with meaningful education. Okay, so schools must provide a meaningful education for the child to show significant progress. Okay. Couple more key components in this case. So while it was a major win for students and their families, it also says that IDEA requires an educational program reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. Endrew makes a case for systems capacity development and is a narrative about students' ethical claim to dignity. Schools must make systems-wide changes to ensure that students with disabilities are learning academic skills. Gone are the days of matching color blocks. Schools must teach using the same grade level standards that they use to teach all students. If the students needs the material to be adapted to their needs, then it must be adapted to their needs. This does not mean that a student must be achieving at the same level as their same age grade peers, but they are learning challenging material that is appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. So based on their unique needs and their placement, all right? So this means that access to those standards and utilizing those standards. But of course, those accommodation modifications are going to look different for every child because of their unique needs. So what did Endrew do? Raise the bar for learning. For children fully integrated in regular classroom, IEP should enable child to achieve passing marks and advance from grade to grade. Okay. So the educational program. This means that the school starts with a non-discriminating evaluation, multidisciplinary evaluation, right? Everything starts with that evaluation. And that is the process outlined in IDEA. You start with the evaluation. The evaluation will identify the educational needs of the student, including social, behavioral, and emotional needs. These needs will then be addressed in the IEP program that is developed with the parent as an equal partner in the process. Part of presuming competence is having those high expectations for your student. In the similar way that we have high expectations for typically developing students. The education of students with disabilities can be made more effective by having high expectations. By ensuring access to the general education curriculum in general education classrooms, we ensure those high expectations. And in this way, when we talk about that, we're talking about LRE, the least restrictive environment. And that's how it's tied to that appropriate education. Endrew also ensures that LEAs, the school districts, follow the process to develop the IEP and that progress is meaningful. And I'll talk a little bit more when I get to the progress section of the presentation. Okay. So reasonably calculated, what does that really mean? We look at the definition of reasonable being sound judgment. Those who develop the IEP, and especially the educators who have specialized training in that judgment, provide reasons for their judgments about the student's IEP, related services, and placements. The role of the parents is to be equal partners in making those educational decisions. The IEP meeting itself will enable the parents to participate as equal partners in deciding what the child's needs are, what services will be provided to meet those needs, and what the anticipated outcomes will be. Families should bring a vision to the IEP team and remember that families are equal partners, not junior partners. So that vision that I just referred to is about what is your vision for your child? What are your high expectations for your child? And it's important to bring that to the table. It can be in writing. And I know the ARC here does really wonderful other trainings, and I know that they have some good resources in helping families, write that out, put it together. The PEAL Center does the same. We also can help families with that vision, but it's important because that helps you to bring, first of all, bring the child's voice to the table, especially if they're not attending the IEP meeting. And you, again, families are equal partners on that IEP team. So your voice really matters a lot. So some practical applications. Endrew F changes expectations for when you're developing the IEPs. So it's not just a procedural checklist. Okay, we did this, we did this, we did this. Sometimes it might feel that way when you're going through an IEP, especially when it's your annual one, because there is a lot to get through and they want to get through all that information. But the IEP is not just a form to be completed, right? It's a legal document. So the IEP must be constructed only after careful consideration of the child's present levels, disability, and potential for growth. And where do we get that information? From that multidisciplinary evaluation, from other testing and assessments. It's all in that present level section. Teacher comments, parents' comments, all of that, gather all that information, and that is where you actually construct the IEP. So when we talk about child's circumstances, the IEP is developed by the IEP team after the team considers the student's present education levels, the needs of the individual student, and the child's potential for growth. So again, I want to repeat the child's potential for growth. When making this determination, the IEP team should be considering presuming competence. Now, regarding behavior, when progress does not occur due to the student's behavior, the IEP team must address the student's behavior. If this is the case, the school should perform what's called a functional behavior assessment, FBA. The FBA should include observations in a variety of environments, input from teachers and the family, and possibly assessments to measure the severity of certain emotional needs of the student. Then following the FBA, the IEP team should come together to develop a positive behavior support plan for the student. A plan that is followed consistently and by all who have contact with the student. So this is really important as far as doing an FBA, because again, behavior is communication. So what is the child communicating through this behavior, no matter what it is? And behavior doesn't have to be, the child, doing something negative. Behavior can just be behavior that you're just not sure what is. A child may not have the right language for where they're at developmentally, or they might have another physical need for some reason that they're not able to, that they're exhibiting a certain behavior. So there's all kinds of reasons to have behaviors, which is why you do the FBA to gather all that information and then consider what do we do, as far as providing that positive behavior support plan for the child. So, there's different special considerations that are part of the child's circumstances. And one of them is the behavior. Another one is language. Another one could be Braille for maybe a student who has those vision supports. And then, of course, you have, some communication needs, a child who might be hard of hearing or anything like that, or a child's circumstances around the need for AT devices, assistive technology. So all of these are child's circumstances. Progress reports. This can be a biggie sometimes. I get a lot of calls around progress reports. So if you look at a copy of an IEP and you look at that goals page, you should see the questions on the slide on that page. These questions must be answered on the IEP. Progress reports are key in ensuring a student is making progress on their IEP goals. So in Pennsylvania, we look for goals to have specific parts. This includes the performance criteria spelled out by the Pennsylvania Department of Education. And that performance criteria includes how well the student will perform the goals for mastery, how consistently the student will perform the skill before it's considered mastered, how frequently the teacher will assess the skill, and how progress will be monitored. The criteria that indicates how frequently the skill will be monitored is key. Educators must identify the fact that a student is or is not making progress with timely identification. So progress using Endrew depends on the 3 factors: the nature of the student's placement, the curriculum developed there and how and by whom it's delivered, and the child's circumstances. So this is what it takes. This is the thought process around progress monitoring, progress reports, what you should be looking for on those progress reports, how they should be, interpreted when you receive that information. So you want to be prepared, right? Is the goal or activity one that our other students this age like to do? So, is the goal or the actual activity, is it really something that students their age like to do? Is it age appropriate for them to be doing something around this goal or activity? Are the methods and materials used to teach the skill age appropriate? So ask the questions. Well, what materials are you using? Here's a perfect example. When my son David, and he always gives me permission to share any stories about him. So, and this was always a good one for me. So Dave, he learned about money almost, all through school, pretty much. Identifying coins, identifying, all the various things. And I think it was middle school. I found out in middle school that they were using like Monopoly, play money. And I was like, my husband and I like, well, no, that's not going to work for David because he needs like real life. Like, what's that going to teach him? Again, mirroring the community, right? So we made sure that on his IEP got written that you use real money, right? Even like some pictures, if they're in color, is good, but sometimes, schools can't do things in color all the time. So what we did and we offered, we sent in, the coins, and we sent in the dollar bills and, fives or whatever. We sent in that money in a Ziploc bag, whatever. So that was David's, money to use. So, but again, that was materials used to, was it age appropriate? Is using Monopoly money age appropriate? It wasn't for our David. So, that gives you an example of things that you can be thinking about. What is going on in the general education classroom and school for students this age? So this is really important because, we kind of lucked out in our household because David had an older sibling. And so I kind of knew what was going to be happening in grades before David got there. And so did David's sibling. So, I would be told that, Mom, I didn't do that in that grade, or Mom, that's not, David shouldn't be doing that. He should. So, which is really important because it needs to be, and because as a parent, I'm thinking, oh no, maybe I need to no, because I was not having my high expectations of David either. So, and obviously a sibling did, so they had the high expectation. So, these are things. So, if you don't have the sibling, the older, maybe a peer, if your child has friends in school, what are they learning? Because let's say you have an only child, so, just different ways that you want to find out, well, what are all the other kids learning and how are they learning? And then you need to be thinking about too, will the goal increase my child's participation in the general education classroom and with other students without disabilities? So again, this is access to the general education curriculum. When they write a goal, will it increase your child's participation somehow along the way for that general education curriculum? Or the grade level curriculum? How will the goal increase my child's opportunity to access the general curriculum? How can this goal be taught in the general education classroom or in general education activities with other students without disabilities? So think about the where are they going to be working on this goal? If my child learns this goal, how will it increase his or her opportunities to be an active member of the school and community? Now, I'm not going to get into goal writing, but I will tell you that one of the handouts that you'll be receiving is about goal writing. Patton, the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network, has a ton of great resources for families. And one of them is writing measurable goals. So that would be a good place to start, is looking at that. But then you want to add in these questions, right? Because these questions aren't on that handout, and they're the questions about, the access. How is this goal increasing participation in that general ed classroom, or, his peers or his or her peers? So these are all questions that you can be asking and looking at those goals on your IEP. I have a feeling some of you might have the IEP in front of you thinking, or after this session, you might pull your child's IEP out and start asking those questions, which is a good thing. That's what you want to do. Start having those high expectations if you have it. So monitoring the IEP implementation. So an IEP should not have the same goals and objectives from year to year, which again, as you heard, that was the one case, the Endrew case. They would go to these IEP meetings and the same goal was on there and the same goal was on there and the objective, like when you're seeing the same or they're not making progress, that's a problem. Is the student receiving benefit? So what do these progress reports show? Are they showing the progress? And if progress isn't being made, what assessments, what things are being done to eventually make some revisions to the IEP for that goal, right? We talked about that a little bit earlier. What do you do first if they're not showing progress? You're going to need to assess it in a different way, maybe, and figure out why they're not making progress. And then figure out, do we need to adjust the goal? Do we need to adjust how to do it? How we're implementing it? What resources are we utilizing? What materials are you using? Consider including supports in the IEP. So maybe a better communication system with the teachers, copies of textbooks and instructional materials, reviewing copies of classwork and tests. So these are all the things that you need to be looking at to consider when you're implementing the IEP and around these goals and things. What are these supports looking like? And if you need more information or you need better communication with the teachers, then you write that on the IEP, because then it needs to be implemented and that's what needs to happen. So when we're moving forward, how does the Endrew case strengthen students' rights? So in a couple ways, right? It requires the IEP team to consider the student's potential for growth. And we talked about that earlier. What is the potential for growth? What are the high expectations that you have? What is the potential and what kind of needs and information do we have in that evaluation that's going to show some of that potential for growth? What does the data show us? You know, is your child, you know, showing really good interest in a certain area? So how can we capture all those great attributes your child has to build on that potential for growth? You emphasizing the progress, not benefit, as a measure of appropriateness. So you're looking at the progress, right? Emphasize the progress, not benefit, as a measure of appropriateness. So when you're thinking about appropriateness, we can go back to those other questions and things that I was talking about. You know, is it grade level? Is it appropriate for your child to be using these different type, you know, like the money example I gave you? So measuring that appropriateness of what they're doing. Moving requires all students have access, and this is what else the Endrew case says. It requires that all students have access to the general education curriculum and to programming that is appropriately ambitious, even when the student is not fully included. So the child does not have to be in that gen ed setting, in that typical classroom. The child could be in that pull out classroom, because I know some families and IEP teams have, you know, the options of maybe children being in, or young adults in an autistic support classroom or a life skills classroom. If that's the case, the student is still required to have access to the general education curriculum. So even though they might be in one of those settings, that doesn't mean that that child still cannot have access to the general education curriculum. And on top of that, it needs to be appropriately ambitious. And that's when you're looking at the age and what the peers are doing and what those students are doing at that grade. And what else the other Endrew case did was states that every child should have the chance to meet challenging objectives. Should have the chance to meet those challenging objectives. So you don't write something just because, you know, oh, I'm not sure if they're going to be able to do this, but no, you want to give it some thought, right? You want it to be challenging because you want them to have progress, but you have to be able to give that child a chance to meet some of those objectives. So, you know, a teacher might try something, you know, for 2 weeks. Well, maybe 2 weeks is not enough time. You know, maybe the teacher's frustrated just in those first 2 weeks. Well, that doesn't mean anything. I mean, quite frankly, my David didn't always show progress in the beginning of the school year, but sometimes by the end of the school year, or maybe even he might not have showed it till the following school year. That doesn't mean we didn't not make adjustments and stuff to his goals, but he was just, you know, took him a little bit longer to actually show and say, hey, I got that. So a lot of times it's hard for teachers because your child or the child may not show progress to what their expectation is sometimes as a teacher. So sometimes that comes into play too. Now let's talk a little bit about instructional strategies. And this is specific to providing access to that grade level curriculum, particularly with students with the complex instructional needs. Because as I said earlier, if you're programming for a child with complex instructional needs, then every child can have access and be successful. Okay. Now, the educational practices for students with complex instructional needs entails a multi-pronged process. First, we need to presume competence and keep the student perspective in focus and continue a balance between grade level content and acquisition to the general education curriculum as well as implementing and meeting functional IEP goals and objectives. How the state of Pennsylvania came to identify a need for we as a state need to provide greater professional development to the teachers and leaders, both general and special ed. So as you see on this slide, here's where, the focus was for students with those complex instructional needs. So back in the 70s, it was like this developmental model. So we'll meet them as developmentally as they grow. So we're just going to look at that developmental stages, and that's it. Then in the 80s, they started talking and using the terms functional or life skills model. What do they really need to function in the community? And a lot of times this wasn't necessarily academics. In the 90s, it went to this more social inclusion. And this is interesting because I think for my son, David, we kind of got stuck in the 80s, 90s, more in the 90s, but the mindset sometimes doesn't leave, because like even if you have teachers in the 80s, they're still teaching sometimes in the 90s. So that mindset of what the professional development was is still there, right? So in the 90s, around social inclusion, and the reason I know that, my son fell in that is because we wanted our son, David, who happens to have Down syndrome, included in general education curriculum with the right supports and services. And I had to, a lot of times I always had a vision for David, but I would get comments about, well, he's being included to be more social with his peers. And there's a part of me that there was a big piece of that. I went to a conference very early on for David, and what I heard at that conference was children with disabilities, once they graduate, they fall off the cliff and they get depressed and they don't have their friends. There was just all these different negative things that I was scared to death. And I was like, oh my gosh, I need to make sure that I develop that circle around him. He needs this, he needs to hold on to those relationships. So relationships was very important. Absolutely. But it wasn't just about social. He still needed to read and write and do, all of those things. But it was hard sometimes. I had to really, look at, you need to be looking at that. And again, because they remembered that model of the 80s, and that's where that thinking was. So now from 1997 to the present, we have a lot more of these cases. There is access and participation in the general education curriculum. There is more access to digital materials. There's a lot of information out there. The patent, you go to patent, there's a lot of great, while school districts, I talked earlier how they really need to identify the professional development, needs to be coming up to the present and really getting access to that professional development to help start changing that mindset and that thinking. So there were some shifts in programming. We now have alternate eligible content. That's something you can get on Patent's website or even just Google on PDE. And that's aligned to the Pennsylvania core standard. So the alternate eligible content is aligned with the Pennsylvania core standard. So we have the supplementary aids and services that can support our students in all environments, right? Many of us talk about what are the supplementary aids and services. There's also what's called a supplementary aids and services toolkit. That is a process that the whole IEP team goes through with a facilitator that looks at the child, that looks at the general ed curriculum, and how can we utilize the child's strengths and needs and get them accessing that general education curriculum. And a lot of times those toolkits are really important to use for students who have the complex instructional needs. So students with those needs, regardless of the setting and program, should be engaged in a school schedule and program similar to their peers. They should be expected to learn challenging academic content. Have an IEP that includes academic and individualized goals with a clear description of how they're accessing that general education curriculum. See, the key word here is access. So no matter what setting they're in, they need to have that access. And here we go. Access to the general curriculum. What is it? So in 1997, federal regulations that defined education for students with disabilities defined general education curriculum as the same curriculum as that established for students with disabilities, now more commonly referred to as IDEA. This definition of general curriculum remains the same. So it's in the law. What does access mean then? Because I was emphasizing that, right? And you probably all kept hearing that. Access. Access requires that the student can actually receive and understand what is being offered. Just being present in a general education classroom does not ensure access. What if the student has a hearing impairment and the teacher lectures with no amplification system? Or if there is text to be read on an 11th grade reading level, but the student reads at a 6th grade level? They do not really have access. Nor does a student have access by just having the book. Perhaps the student has a vision impairment and requires a Braille text. Or a student with dyslexia requires an audio version of the text. So the IEP team builds appropriate accommodations and modifications into the IEP document for students to ensure they really do have access to the general education curriculum. So I'm going to refer to the chat again. Why is it important for your child or another child you care about to have access to the general education curriculum? So I'll give you a couple minutes to think about that, because you might have to write a sentence or two. But why is it important for your child or another child you care about to have access to the general education curriculum? Okay. So one comment is, because how can we set high expectations if we don't know what the bar is set at? In order to know what he is fully capable, he needs to be challenged. You just don't know what they will learn. You can't always predict this. Very good, because it is their legal right as well. As I noted in one of the slides, right? It is an IDEA. Any other thoughts? Okay. Thank you for participating. And think about this as we move forward. Instructional practices that support high expectations for all learners. So how can we assist in maximizing access to the general education curriculum for students with complex instructional needs? What can we do? So some of you may be familiar with, it used to be called Families to the Max, MAX. And that was an initiative several years ago with the patent, with PEAL and the Bureau. And so I think it's important that if you're not familiar with Families to the Max, that you do, because it's a group of families. There's also various trainings that they do. And they really assist families who maybe struggle, or educators who struggle with the actual instructional practices. And what do you do for that child who has complex instructional needs? You can utilize some of the methods that are on this slide. And I've already talked about about these already. The standard aligned instruction, supplementary aids and services, assistive technology, accommodations, modifications. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of these instructional practices that supports expectations for all learners. So we'll try and give you some good examples. So, designing standard aligned instruction. So these questions serve as an aid to teams and teachers as they consider how to align instruction for students with complex instructional needs to the Pennsylvania standards. So for the standard aligned instruction, family member wanted the same curriculum for their child as everyone had in the class. What are the standards? Look at the standards on the SAS, on the supplementary aids, the standard aligned systems portal. The portal is accessible to everyone. And you start with the standard in the pre-K, then built goals upon that standard. Then in kindergarten, you built upon the goal learned in pre-K to standards taught in kindergarten. To keep it aligned, we always put what the standard was after each goal. The goal was connected to the curriculum standard, and this was promising. So this is where you can actually see it on the IEP as well, if you're listing the standard after each goal. Okay, so these questions will help you with that standard aligned instruction. I'm sorry, I muted myself. All right, standard aligned. Yeah, you were about to tell me that too. I saw this little note come across my screen. It says something about me being muted. I'm like, really? I realized I hit it wrong. Sorry about that. All right. So supplementary aids and services means aids, services, and other supports that are provided in general education classes, other education-related settings, and in extracurricular and non-academic settings to enable the children with disabilities to be educated with their non-disabled children to the maximum extent appropriate in accordance with the Code of Federal Regulations. So that code that's listed on the bottom of the slide is exactly what I just said. The purpose of providing supplementary aids and services is to support students with disabilities as active participants with non-disabled peers, as well as to enable their access to the general education curriculum. So to that end, supplementary aids and services include modification to the general education curriculum, and a child with a disability is not removed from education in age-appropriate regular classrooms solely because of needed modification in the general curriculum. That is also in the code as well. So here is some really good language and some codes that are in the federal codes that you can use when you're thinking about, when you're talking about the standard aligned curriculum, when you're talking about supplementary aids and services. You can reference the language that's in the federal regs. And earlier, I even spoke to, when we talk about, other education related settings or extracurricular So that means if they're doing any kinds of, sports clubs, things like that, if they need, they have some type of supplementary aid and service for the academics. And if it's found that they need to do that in the activity that they're doing, a club that they're participating in, then, they need those accommodations and modifications there as well. You have to consider all areas of when the child is in any type of school sponsored activity. So supplementary aids and services should be available to all students who need them, designed to provide meaningful educational benefit, and provided in a manner that avoids stigmatizing students. And that is actually in another case called the Gaskin settlement. So that is another resource that you can have that also helps you around supplementary aids and services and not stigmatizing students. Supplementary aids and services are specific to the accommodations and modifications made throughout the child's day that support their meaningful participation. Again, it's got to be meaningful, right? Like, you don't just do it just to do it. Is it really meaningful for that child to be doing or to make these modifications for them, right? So some of the areas might include the environment. It might be the actual instructional sequences. It could be staff supports. It could be testing accommodations. There's all kinds of various things. Looking at the environment, the classroom itself, the practice is there is a large group instruction. What is the barrier of the student from having them participate? Too noisy, student will have trouble participating. And then you also think about what is the strategy for the student? How can we have the student participate in that setting? Can the student self-monitor and have feedback from the teacher? All right, this is when you're looking at that environment. We ask ourselves, what is the general education practice? What is the needs of the student? And what is the strategy we can use for the student to participate? Again, I talked earlier and referenced the SAS toolkit, the Supplementary Aids and Services toolkit. The toolkit teases these kinds of questions out because there's an infinite number of possible supplementary aids and services. Sometimes I am asked, from families, do you have any suggestions? Or I said, well, there's a ton, and of course, it really depends on the child and the unique needs and, all those various factors. But, there are some general lists. And actually, I think Patton even has a handout around supplementary aids and services to give you an idea about the different environments and what some possible accommodations or modifications can be. So that is a publication, I believe it's called Supplementary Aids and Services. It's not the toolkit, but I think it has another name to it, but I'm sure if you Google it, you'll find it. But even the toolkit, there is an overview for families. So I would encourage you going to Patton's website for that as well. And probably I'm thinking the ARC might even, I'm throwing all this stuff out. They might want to, as they do their follow-up, send out some links and things like that. I know they're very resourceful as well. You can always ask to do that. Thank you. Okay. Assistive technology. So in IDEA and Pennsylvania law and regulations 14 and 711 require that teams consider assistive technology needs for every student with an IEP. So what is it? What is assistive technology? An assistive technology device, as defined in IDEA, is any item, piece of equipment, or product system, whether acquired commercially off the shelf, modified, or customized, that is used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities of a child with a disability. Assistive technology devices range in complexity from no or low-tech tools, such as a pencil grip, or maybe a customized mouse for, to high-tech tools. Maybe it's specialized software or electronic voice output communication devices. This definition does not include medical devices that are surgically implanted, such as cochlear implants, or the replacement of any such device. So basically, assistive technology, as defined by federal law, may also be a service. Any service that directly assists a child with a disability in the selection, acquisition, or use of an assistive technology device. So in order to find out about assistive technology, you might need to start with an evaluation first. So that assistive technology is an evaluation that you would need for the school to do. And that will better give you an idea of what the child may be able to have more access to a particular curriculum or classroom or anything like that. And once it's determined by this multidisciplinary team about AT, then you start exploring and trying different various things, if it's an actual piece of equipment or software or anything like that. So the team should consider the following when exploring options for a student. You want to think about activities and routines of the student's day, where it might work the best. If it's something around reading, or maybe communication with their peers, where's the best thing? Where's the best location? Academic tasks. So where can we help within the curriculum somewhere? And there may, and in addition to utilizing and figuring out and exploring different assistive technology devices, you want to also make sure you're collecting data around whatever you're trying, because you don't want to keep on doing and it's not working, right? So having it actually spelled out, this will be a trial for 2 months, or this is what, whatever that's going to be. Having all those pieces, those details written out, so that it isn't something that you just kind of do. And in addition to that, there's going to need to be training on whatever it might be too. So you think about that once you find out what's really good and working for the student. So accommodations versus modifications. Now, another avenue which provides access to the general education curriculum for the students with complex needs is this difference between accommodations and modifications. So accommodations levels the playing field for students with disabilities. So here's various things that you may think about when you're thinking about accommodations. But even though it's leveling the playing field for students, it also does not change the learning goal. Okay. Let me try and get more on there. Modifications changes the learning goal, and it may reduce academic expectations as well. So this is a list of some examples. Certainly is not an exhaustive list of different examples of accommodations and modifications. So the specific thing you really want to remember here is that accommodations does not change the learning expectation, right? So the expectation is still there. Students who receive accommodations are expected to learn the same material as their peers. For example, a child with visual impairment may need Braille or enlarged print in order to access the same text as their peers. Now, students who receive modifications are not expected to learn the same material as their peers, but rather a different version of the learning. So for example, while typical peers are required to write a 5-paragraph essay, a student with a modified curriculum may be required to write only one paragraph. So these are some of the ideas that you can be thinking about, and some of how hopefully it helps you figure out what an accommodation is and what modifications are. Hopefully this helps you a little. So what does it actually look like? So let's go back to the very beginning around presuming competence, right? So by presuming competence, educators come up with increasingly creative, innovative ways for individuals to learn. Families with this new information may want to share the overarching principles of presuming competence and use this slide's information to tell their child's teacher, here is how to approach all children, not just my child, right? Because it should be for all learners. You know, wanting to be fully included, weighing acceptance and appreciation, wanting to learn, wanting to be heard, and wanting to contribute. So an example maybe that, to put this into perspective, would be maybe a student, you know, different students have different jobs in kindergarten, for example, right? So, and maybe a student needs to access the elevator when switching floors. So in an IEP, you can have where it reads that the student who needs the elevator chooses who goes with him or her on the elevator, right? So that can be something that, you know, I get, you know, as a child, I get to choose who does this with me. And maybe also choosing who becomes the line leader, who gets to sharpen the pencils, you know, things like that. So thinking creatively about what that can look like for the student. So let's talk about ethics, culture, and dignity. IDEA reminds us of these important tenets of disability law. Disability, and I'm going to read them because it's really important. Disability is a natural part of the human experience. All children can learn. Disability in no way diminishes the right of individuals to participate in or contribute to society. And that is in IDEA. The Endrew case affirms the dignity of students with disabilities. The Endrew case reminds everyone that all students can learn. All students have potential, and all students are entitled to challenging a curriculum. So I'm going to end that. And I know we have probably, I know it was I was told 6:30, 8:30. So I left about 30 minutes here for questions and answers that I have not been looking at. So I don't know. And here's my contact information at the PEAL Center. You can reach us in many ways, going to our website. We have an email address, info@PEAL Center, or we also have our phone number. So, you know, feel free to contact us or myself.
Great. Thank you so much, Diane. This was a super helpful conversation and presentation. Really appreciate you touching on all of these topics as they relate to challenging goals and expectations.